Looks like getting a few things squared away here. Hopefully this is working. No idea. Actually, this is my first time using the OBS to broadcast live to YouTube here, so this is a learning experience for me. Looks like things are going. Hopefully you guys can hear all right. Let me know in the future if this audio is all right. I haven't used the webcam audio, which was all right, but there might be a bit of echo because I get the wall behind it there. But outside of that, I usually can get a mic or something like that from my wife, but she's using it today. So anyway, let me know, leave a comment if the audio needs to be improved or anything like that. Usually this works all right, but anyway, first time challenges here. All right, so today I wanted to just kind of give you guys a quick overview of my entry into the SIS, their Sports Info Solutions Football Analytics Challenge. This analytics challenge was put on by this group. They released some of their proprietary play-by-play data, including some individual player data actually broken out by defensive linemen. So linebackers, defensive ends, and defensive tackles. And they asked a few questions around that data, and I'll walk you through what I've done today and some of the things I found along the way. One thing I wanted to mention before I get started here is I'm at the very beginning of my journey to becoming a data analyst, and so me learning R and keeping everything very, very entry level today, so just very simple linear models, linear regressions, and a few ANOVA tests, some Tukey tests, things like that. I'll explain those when we kind of get to them, but there isn't much advanced modeling done during my things or some really more aggressive or more interesting kind of clustering analysis in terms of looking at values. So everything should be pretty understandable. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. All right, so quick review what we're going to be doing today. We're just going to be jumping through the findings, kind of look at some just general process and what we do with the data. Then we'll go into how I like to analyze the data or some of the results that I found in regards to true pressure rate, positional value, player talent and that talent's distribution, and some limitations and things that we can look forward to actually what we could do if we had more data, right? If you see there on the left side of the screen, I do have on Twitter at rbkeeney, and you can find my Patreon. I've got some data there. Unfortunately not this data because it's proprietary and asked us not to share it. I can share the findings, but I've got a lot of other data there and some models built for fantasy football stuff, as well as some play-by-play data around like passing rates, etc. So anyway, growing all the time. If you want to go check it out, it's pretty awesome. All right, so competition questions. These are kind of the three general questions that they had asked us to submit answers to, and then they were going to score us on all three. So first one is really just which position on the defensive line is the most valuable, and we can define those positions in however we'd like. I'll explain how I did that. And then what's the distribution of talent around those defensive positions, and then look at different situations or possible roster construction scenarios that might change the answers to the above questions. So definitely was able to answer the first two. The third one, we'll see. I think honestly, with my skill level, if I come in second to last out of, I don't know, I think there's probably 20 to 50 submissions based on kind of what I saw when I submitted mine, I'd be really happy. So anyway, we'll see how it's going. All right, I'm going to take a quick check back on the YouTube real quick just to see if things are kind of coming in. All right, so looks like we've got one viewer, but hopefully everything's working all right for them. Kind of terrible that won't know until after this is done if everything turned out all right. So anyway, back to it. Anyway, let me know if you leave a comment or something like that if it's working all right. That'd be great, just for me, so I don't waste your time. All right, so what does the data look like? Actually, if you're familiar with NFL Fast R or NFL Scrape R data, play-by-play data, it's pretty similar. So luckily I've had spent quite a bit of time analyzing that data and playing with that data and organizing it and kind of seeing what's meaningful there. So I did definitely felt like I had kind of a jump start playing with this data. What was interesting about this data set is that each play was replicated by the number of players that were recorded as being up front or were influencing the play in terms of, there's some other players that are listed like as off ball. But generally thinking these are the players that are on the line for the defensive team, and it's listed for the number of players there. We give their we get attributes like if there was pressure on the play. We have EPA as provided by SIS. It's about 8 to 9 weeks of data, the second half of 2009, and then we get the interesting stuff, which is the player data for each play, which is are they rushing or not, what technique are they playing, I'll describe that in a minute, what roster position were they, did they generate a pressure, did they generate a sack, assisted tackle, solo tackle, etc., etc. There's also some really interesting things about rushing data, so rush direction, intended rush gap, and whether the offensive team was actually able to use that intended rush gap. So we looked at a bunch of that stuff, trying to find really how defensive players affect the play from that front. So a lot of the analysis that was provided, the data that was provided by the SIS team, I think their intention was that it really was built around some of their different defensive technique or where the players were on the given play. And so really what you can think about as a technique name for SIS is really just where that defensive player was aligned versus the offensive front. So as you can see here, if a player was playing directly over the center, they would be given a technique name of 0. If they were directly over the tackle here, they would be given a number 4 as their technique name. And that goes all the way up to 9. They do have some outside data, and they do have off the ball data for the different technique names. But those are kind of the big buckets there. All right. So I kind of just jump into some key findings here, and then I'll try to answer the different questions that they have asked in a little bit more detail. I think the first thing to note is that a pretty significant finding was that the further outside a player plays, so if we think 0 as being right over center, and then moving outside all the way to 9 and then outside, the further outside a player was, or their technique number, the higher their true pressure rate. I'll describe true pressure rate more in a minute, but essentially true pressure rate is just if a player was rushing, what was their pressure rate? So it's excluding plays where they didn't rush the passer. The next one that we kind of found there is that we can actually look at players' individual true pressure rate, and it correlates actually a little bit to their team's success rate against the pass. R-squareds are pretty weak here. It's a R-squared of like 0.1 to 0.3, depending on how many things you actually take into account there. There's a few additional other factors like number of defenders, blitz rate, etc., things like that. But it's actually significant, and it's really hard to find data that correlates to defensive success on the pass level, or I guess it's normally we think about when we look at all the NFL data from like NFL Fast Start, the play-by-play data. It's pretty easy to say that most of the success of a passing game, it correlates to how well the offense is. So it's interesting to find some weak to mild relationships, things that might actually correlate to the defense's skill or what the defense is actually doing. So I thought that was interesting. That's where a lot of my data a lot of my analysis will focus, and we can actually predict at a pretty reasonable level, like between adjusted R-square value of like 0.7 to 0.5 to 0.6 for actually true pressure rate or pressure rate for a team based on the individual players on the team, which kind of goes to expected, right? If we're looking at players who are good at pass rushing, their teams will be better at generating pressure, right? But it's interesting that there's some few additional factors that we can look at that actually improve that analysis pretty significantly. And then the final caveat here is a lot of the analysis that I do with this data is almost all based, it is all based on pass plays and typically pressure. And that's really because I couldn't find any correlation between player, quote unquote, talent or position to rush results. There is some meaningful things in terms of like rush play success, in terms of like where the offensive team chose to run. There is some differentiation in success levels if the defensive team was able to make that offensive team change the gap that they intended to run through. But if you look at it at a specific like position or player level, there's really no significance across like players or positions influencing rush gaps, even if you sort by rush plays or tackle rates or things like that. I think the only correlation I found on tackle rates was if the rush is up the middle or like a gap, then techniques in the middle are more likely to make a pass, more likely to make a tackle. And that finding was significant, but if you start to look at any sort of gap beyond that, so B, C, which is kind of progressively moving outside, and then D gap, which is outside, there really is no correlation to even tackle rate, which was a bit frustrating. And then, of course, if you can't find any correlation to tackle rate or run gap changing or anything like that, the correlation to rush pass success is 0. So it is, anyway, we focus on passing it. All right, this slide here, we'll kind of skip over it pretty lightly here. I think the general kind of process for setting up the data was generally there wasn't a whole lot that needed to be done. I did add a few factors on kind of like looking at the number of defensive linemen, so people with hands on the ground, or linebackers is anybody who doesn't have their hands on the ground, and then looking at the number of rushers per play to calculate like kind of a blitz rate. And then also looking at the average number of defenders in total up front. Did parse a little bit of the play descriptions out. So pulled out shotguns, got rid of plays that were labeled as broken plays, which typically like a fumbled snap or something like that. Kneel, spikes, etc. I will note that all the pressure or all the pass plays do include all QB scrambles because we can actually see what players are rushing there. Unfortunately, no QB scramble play had a pressure on it, so we don't know if I was really hoping to see if like certain types of pressure would force QBs to scramble, or if that was something we could look at. It doesn't seem to be the case, at least in the data that's included here. All right. So I just talked about the scrambling because they don't include any pressures. They don't include rushing data. And I think the big caveat here, as we kind of step forward and start analyzing the data, is that we don't have any information on the offensive alignment outside of the technique that's given, and we don't know the personnel. And so if we're going to be evaluating defensive talent, we kind of have to make some assumptions, and the big one there is that we're facing, like the defenders are all facing equal competition. It's a little bit easier thing to say over like a larger sample size, right? You assume there's first some good defenders and some bad defenders, but I'll get more into that in terms of like players that are better on left side of the line or right side of the line, etc. Some inclusions I made there, but generally speaking, we're going to be assuming that the defenders are facing equal competition across each position. So defensive tackle, the guards and centers aren't better or worse than the tackles or tight ends, I guess, in this case. All right, so what kind of processes and assumptions did I make? I think the big thing here is I kind of hit on this is generally doing linear or logistic regressions, ANOVA, which is kind of like similar to a t-test, but you're looking at more groups, so all the techniques, for example. And we kind of look at significance between the groups and see what's important, not what's important, but what's meaningful if something it's more meaningful to play outside, for example, than it is inside, things like that. Outside of that, I think there's anything that would interest you guys so much. This just lays out the process of how I went through the data and then answer the questions. So, all right, so let's dive into the teams here. But I'm gonna jump back to YouTube real quick and see if everything's going okay. Let's see if this is working. All right. no comments yet, so hopefully that means you can hear me actually. All right, so I did a bunch of different analyses by kind of looking at different groups to start. And really what I wanted to do from kind of a foundational level is prove, or at least show what sort of things I should be looking at that were useful for future analysis. So if pressure correlates to success rate, then we should look at what player data level player data correlates to pressure rate, things like that. So this is kind of like assuming that we know nothing about the data and saying that is EPA good, is success rate good, is pressure good, and we know those things are good, but we wanted to kind of dive in and show that those things were true. Did that by team level, and we're specifically looking at what things the defense is responsible for. So I've got a few charts coming up here, but we're going to be focusing on success rate. One of the reasons there is that if we look at success rate here, so the y-axis in this case is average success of a defense against the pass. So top right is very bad. So the Jaguars and Lions were very bad against the pass. The Ravens and the Steelers were very good against the pass. And then the x-axis there is EPA per play. So this is just showing that there is a pretty strong correlation between EPA per play and the success rate of a play, which a success rate is just saying if EPA is positive, you assign 1. If it's not positive, you say it's 0. So how often do they have positive EPA per play? EPA, for those of you who may not know, is expected points added, and maybe I can put some more links to it. I'll assume that most of you guys know what that is. Generally speaking, you're looking at kind of a down and distance and field location. There are some other additional things looking, I believe, at time of game that goes into it. For example, I think typically for you to have a positive EPA on a first down rush, depending on your field position, it's usually between like 5 and 6 yards. Anyway, that's kind of how it goes. So, all right. So, if we take a look at pressure, the average pressure a team had on a play, so yes pressure or no pressure, average that over the 8 to 9 game sample that we have for each team, and look at that versus success on the y-axis. We see that the correlation is a little hard to see here, but it's r squared of 0.32, which is like a mild to weak correlation, and the slope is significant here. So it's a pretty safe assumption to say that if you generate more pressure as a team over this population of plays, you're going to be more successful on average at stopping or reducing the amount of points the offense is expected to score. Now, if we look at average pressure versus EPA, we see that the slope is non-significant and the r-squared value is very, very low. It's essentially saying that EPA is not really correlated to average pressure. There's a lot of reasons for this, but I think primarily what we can say is that EPA tends to be really focused on like first downs, sacks, touchdowns, and turnovers. Those are kind of like the spike plays. So it's a kind of a higher variance stat. So I wanted to focus more on success rate, and the reason for that is I'm looking for kind of what sort of factors result in consistent success. So if there's a blown coverage or something like that, or just they're getting a first down, I don't want to overweigh that. Also, it gets a little bit noisy. We do know that there's a pretty good correlation between success rate and EPA. If we can predict success rate a little bit better than EPA, that's where why I chose to focus on success rate for future analysis here. What I will say for all of this is super beginner level here. So if you have any suggestions on things I should have done differently or things I might have missed, I am learning, and part of the learning process is trying to figure out how to set up live stream. And then the other part of it is getting better at analyzing data. So mistakes were probably made, answers were probably not answer very well for all of these things. But again, like I said, if I come in second to last place, hooray. So, all right. So here are the findings by play, what kind of the key findings by play. So this is looking at every play. So we're assuming that we're lumping all the teams together here, and we're excluding all the individual player data. So it's a little bit different analysis than looking at the player level, because we're kind of focusing on either position or player groupings for all our different analyses. But on this level, we're looking just at play-by-play data. So there's a few things we can just kind of quickly prove via some of the Tukey rate tests. Is first of all, kind of as expected with the pass chart, pass plays with a success rate they were like, if you had pressure, they were 23% less successful than plays without pressure. So it kind of goes to expected, right? Kind of matches up with the earlier chart there. If a play or a team, or I should say, if a team didn't use their intended rush gap on a play, their success rate of that rush was reduced by about 4%. And these are all significant findings. I think I noted here that the p-value is all less than your kind of 0.05. Some of these were like much less than 0.05. Blitzing didn't lead to a difference in success rate or a significant difference in success rate or EPA, but it did increase your pressure rate. So that's kind of an interesting thing here. So just at a play-by-play level, blitzing causes more pressure, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be more successful, or at least not to a significant level. That's something I'll focus on more in a little bit, because if you tie that into some other data, you can actually find some really interesting correlations. But kind of keep that in mind, that blitzing doesn't necessarily mean you're more successful, it just means you get more pressure. All right. The next thing that I did was look by position, and before I do that, let me grab a quick drink. Got my Pilsen E. This is just a light beer from Paraguay, actually. So that's where I'm located. Anyway, it's my drink of choice at the moment. Hey, I want to check YouTube. See if anything's are going here. Okay. Hopefully everything's are good. Anyway, it's pretty good. There's not a ton of beer here in Paraguay in terms of like craft beers and things like that. You can get kind of your typical Budweiser, Miller, Light, Heineken, kind of the generic brands. But there's not a lot of craft beers. There's like one or two places around that make some okay ones. I'm not a huge IPA guy, so I tend to kind of stay away from some of them. But there's a few. Palo Santo Brewery here in Assumption is pretty good. Make a few different ones. But yeah, I miss being back in the States a little bit. Nice. All right. Anyway, diving back in here, looking at by position. So this is looking at a number of different factors here. We say, all right, if we take all the play-by-play data and we organize it by position, what sort of positions can we look at? So we look at on-field position, which is kind of, are they on the line with their hand down or not? So kind of think about it like DL or linebacker type of player. Roster position, so what they are listed on their team's website. So defensive tackle, defensive edge, or linebacker, and then we have safeties and cornerbacks actually that show up often on blitzes actually. And we have side of ball and technique name, which I went into a little bit, and then we have rushing data, rushing gap data, etc. So those are all things that we can kind of sort all of our different plays by, and then take a quick look and try to find what's significant. Quick note here is that there are some significant findings on some of like the on-field positions, so hand down or not. That's all due to their technique location or where they are when the play starts. There are also some significant findings by roster position, but again, it's really about where the player is actually located when they're rushing the passer. than versus their actual roster position. That it's has to do with where they are on the field or their technique name, not so much how they're described by the team. And side of ball is interesting because if you look at it from like a high level, it is significant, pretty significant actually. I think it's like less than 0.01 p-value. However, it's actually not true for any position or technique, like kind of alignment, except for the outside position for solely linebackers and defensive ends. And so that entire effect is driven by kind of the left versus right, kind of outside rusher positions. This is all looking at like kind of true rush rate or rushing conversion rate, things like that for the defensive player. And the difference there is like 2.3%, and it's very significant. I will note here that because of these findings, I'm assuming for future, analyzing this in the future, position or kind of group, your technique name, whatever you want, the alignment, that left versus right is the same. And that's proven to be, or at least I can show it to be, a very valid assumption to make across all the different alignments and groups, whether by roster position, on-field position, so up or down, and then technique, with the exception of the outside technique. And at this point, I chose to assume that the gap there is driven by player talent, and not by technique, the location or their competition. So I had a choice here when I was going to start modeling the kind of expected pressure rate for the different groups. And what I chose is to say that difference that I'm seeing here is driven by player talent, so therefore I should not correlate that to being more advantageous or disadvantageous to be rushing on the light or left side. So that could be a shortcoming of analysis, or a good thing depending on if I'm right about that assumption or not. I already talked about rush plays a little bit here. This is just being a little bit more explicit about it, but really couldn't find any correlation between position that a player would be playing and their influence in a run play. So really what we're going to be doing is looking only at pass plays, for better or worse. Quick aside, actually, Josh Hersmeyer at 538 has done some really awesome analysis on players in the box, which I have partial information on that with this data set, and then down, and I think it's down at distance, or just down to, or where they are on the field, and he can describe, I think it's like 90% of like an average yardage gain by where they are at and the number of players, defensive players in the box. So this data kind of is saying the same thing. It's saying defensive position doesn't seem to matter a whole lot on rush plays. If you guys follow Betts on Twitter, he would say that it's all about the angles, or I can't remember what he says. Anyway, he's gonna make fun of me for that. But so run stuff. I don't know. Angles in the rushing and passing game. Or defensive game is things I don't understand. Maybe someday. Anyway, at Betts, BETZ, is a good follow there if you want to learn more about that. And then Josh Hersmeyer, I think he's like Frisco Josh, has some awesome analysis too, that I'd recommend if you wanted to kind of look at defensive versus defensive alignment or defensive fronts, players in the box, to rushing success rate, or kind of how they counter each other. Oh, it's interesting. Anyway, we'll focus on my passing plays. All right, so finally what we did is we start to look at this by the player level. And what we want to do here is, since we're finding that there's significance in terms of a team's overall pressure rate, we want to try to find which players are contributing to that at a significant level, and if we're able to kind of find how teams do that, or how teams generate pressure. So what we want to do actually is we want to say on, or what I did, or as I said, I tried to find out like which players are really good at converting their opportunities that they have at rushing the passer into a pressure. So true pressure rate is just a short way of saying it's the rate at which a player generates a pressure when they are rushing. So if they are a linebacker and they aren't rushing on a play, we're not going to count that play against them. Where if we just looked at kind of pressure rate as a whole, it would count against them, right? We would, even though they're going to do a different thing on that play. And we're going to use this to kind of look at the quote-unquote cost of pressure. If we think of like pressure as a semi-function of like what the offense is doing, so pass play and how many offensive players are in the way, whether they have tight end, whether they have running back, what does their personnel look like, and then how many players are rushing, where are those players rushing from, how much does it cost, or what kind of correlates to a team getting better pressure or not. And what we find here is we start to see some players rising to the top here. So Leon Jacobs is the absolute top of the list in terms of true pressure rate, and kind of sorted on down. So this is just a quick screen grab of kind of the true pressure rate for these different players. Some players that you would recognize as jumping at the top of the list. So Darius Smith on the Packers had an outstanding year last year. Shaquille Barrett on the Bucks was awesome. T.J. Watt. There's a few other players that both are brothers. Aaron Donald. It's kind of where you expect them to be, all up in that high teen, about high teens in terms of true pressure rate. If you take one jump over there, look at pressure rate, and so this column here, you can see that some of those numbers don't always correlate very well to their true pressure rate. So Leon Jacobs wasn't actually asked to rush very often. He did have over 100 rushing cases there. I have my puppy here. I gotta let her out the door. Go for it, Luna. We adopted she's 1 month old. Oh goodness. 1 month old Labrador lab. So she's yellow lab. She's a hoot, but a lot of fun. Anyway, so you can see here true pressure rate there, and then some of the different other categories that I was looking at: blitz participation rate, pass breakup rate, if a team, when they were on the field, used their intended gap, and average tackle rate. Didn't really find anything useful outside of that. We will look at a little bit at blitz participation rate for certain positions, but on a player level, not so much. All right. True pressure rate. So to develop the true pressure, we want to look at what correlates most from a player level, and one of those things is a true pressure rate. So we're looking at the 5 most common players as listed by team, and then we're going to, so the 5 most common players that are on the field and either are rushing, we can look at that, or just most common defensive players in front, or their 5 best rushers, and kind of look at the results of that, and we build a model for that. So what we do is we do that by team, and we kind of get their true pressure rate here. So we can see the 49ers had a pretty good kind of number 1 passer, I think Bosa probably there, and then the number 2 rusher in terms of true pressure rate, 3, 4, 5. The reason we stop at 5 is to become apparent in a minute, but past 5, the correlations kind of just fall off, and it's pretty random. And an average, just to see kind of how good the most common players or the most common rushers were on a given team. All right, so here are some of the different correlations if we're looking at just at how well the best rusher in terms of true rushing percentage correlated to their team's pressure rate. So the best rusher had a pretty reasonable correlation to the team's pressure rate, 0.28, moving down 0.25, 0.21, 0.2 for the fourth, and then for the fifth, really isn't any correlation there. So really the top four players there do show a mild to weak correlation to a team's pressure rate. I think I don't have it listed here, but if you average or use all of them, the R squared value I think is around 0.5 or so, 0.5 to 0.6. So it kind of tells us that it's pretty dependent on the rushers that are there, or the talent of the players that are available for the team. Talent in terms of who's rushing the ball or not, and who's capable of getting pressure. But there's some things that we're not accounting for, whether it be variance is somewhere, and I'll show some of how that variance can be accounted for in a minute. But just a note there, you can look at that across a bunch of different ways on how to kind of get these 5 best players. The results generally hold pretty true, where kind of 1, 2 are the most influential, and then kind of falls off. So one thing that I found was pretty interesting on this analysis is that the best pass rusher on the team is often the second or third most common pass rusher on a team. And I don't know if that's just because defensive tackles, they have a pretty high, players who play in the interior tend to have a pretty high rush rate in terms of they are rushing the passer almost all the time. They're not really typically asked to do anything else on pass plays, where some of the edge defenders, especially linebackers, are asked to do things other than rush the passer at a reasonable rate. So that can kind of tell you what positions, in terms of traditional positions, get the most pressure. All right, so if we look at the top 4 players and look at a team's blitz rate, so this is kind of bringing in some different things. So we're looking at the top 4 players on a team's blitz rate, and the average number of defenders that they had up front. There's a mild to strong correlation. So R squared, it's adjusted R squared value. So if you look at R squared, if this was actually a plot, it'd be like 0.7, but adjusted R squared, looking at a number of different things here, 0.64 to that team's pressure, which is, I thought was pretty good. It's a pretty significant boost if we're just looking at pressures. And so one of the more significant findings here is that the average number of defenders up front is actually negatively correlated to a team's pressure rate. And this might be because the teams that can generate a lot of pressure with a fewer number of players don't tend to have a lot of pressure people up front. However, if we look at a team's blitz rate, that actually flips. So it almost seems like if you have really good rushers and you're able to have less players on the line, that's really good. And then you blitz on top of that, that's like a kind of a force multiplier. I'll get to that in a second. And this is I think probably one of the more interesting findings in this analysis, is that if we're looking at pass play success as a mild to weak correlation, or just at R squared value about 0.35, just a linear model here. If we look at the single best pass rusher, remember that best pass rusher had a pretty good correlation. It's like in the 0.17 R squared value to a team's defensive team success rate against the pass. But if we include the best pass rusher, the blitz rate, and the average number of defenders up front, we can see that we can account for 0.35, so about 30% of the variance in a defense's success rate against the pass. This is for, of course, limitations here. We've only got the 8 to 9 weeks of data, and we don't know what's predictive of in the future, right? So I think there's been some studies by PFF, saying this off the top of my head. It's like pressure rates are somewhat consistent player to player, or at least their grades are year to year. So this could possibly be looking at something that would be useful for teams, saying like if you've got a good rusher and you've got a team that can generate like blitzes off the side, so specifically probably using safeties and cornerbacks off the outside, because they have a really good true pressure rate. It doesn't, skill is kind of hard designate there because there's not a ton of plays for those folks. But if you got a good pass rusher, one of them, and a good high blitz rate, and you don't use a ton of defenders up front, it seems like he's kind of like a force multiplier. So good rusher and then blitz, like the Steelers or the Ravens, the Bucks I think actually blitz quite a bit too, and they both all had pretty decent players in that kind of best rusher slot, and we're all very successful against the pass in terms of success rate. All right. So if we kind of take a step back from that player and go back to positions, since we can prove that, or at least since we say that the success rate of a team is correlated to the pressure rate by a player, next we want to say is, so what positions generate the most pressure? Because the better pressure that you can generate, it's correlated to a team's overall pressure, and that pressure or that player's performance is also weakly correlated to the team's success against the pass. And so what we find here is that, forgive the chart, it's a little noisy here, but generally speaking, as you start from the center, go to the outside, the pressure rate generally about doubles from the interior positions to the exterior and outside positions. So just a note here, I'm not adjusting for outside, and I'm not adjusting for DL, DE, or LB players. We'll get into that in a second. We did split out, or I did split out corners and safeties because they have a much higher blitz participation rate, and their expected pressure rate is significantly higher as a result. So this could be a possible shortcoming for my analysis earlier. We saw Leon Jones. I get his name right. Leon Jones had a really high pressure rate, but he also had like one of the highest blitz participation rates. So he was generating his pressure on blitz plays. I mean, he had like a 25% blitz rate. So that was is impressive, but maybe there's some the blitz rate is influencing a little bit there. Anyway, so we'll split out cornerbacks and safeties and not include them in our defensive lineman, quote unquote, positions. So to answer question one, the most valuable defensive line position are those on the exterior, so further outside, directionally independent, because they're more effective at generating pressure when they are asked to rush. And remember, it's like about the player playing like in the 7-6-9 position is about twice as likely to generate pressure as someone playing like a 0 through 2 position here. So someone between on the center to guard is about half as likely to generate pressure as a player who's playing out here, and that increases even more if you're a cornerback or someone out here, DB, blitzing, typically from the outside. All right. So if we look at how that correlates to kind of what we think about as a traditional roster position, linebackers have the highest value, and this is specifically driven from who generates pressure when they are asked to rush, and then it's DB, defensive ends and defensive tackles. However, that's it's all driven by what technique they're playing. It's not actually driven by their roster position. It's also true for whether they were kind of hand on the ground or not, depending on their stance. To look at player talent, what we do is we just say, okay, based on your technique that you're playing, we would expect you to have this pressure rate. And then we say, look at all the different plays across all your different positions, and we say, what was your actual versus your expected? And this is what I call just an adjusted true pressure rate. So it's saying if a player is generating pressure more often than they would be expected, given the positions that they're playing, you would give them a positive number here. And that's a positive percentage beyond typically what like an average would be for their positions. So what we do is we group all the players by play, by technique, and what we can see here is that this list starts to pull up a lot more of the defensive tackles, which is pretty interesting, I think, because we're starting to see different defensive tackles that are excelling in the interior of the line, which means, and they might not be getting kind of the best overall pressure rate, because those are dominated by players who play on the edge, if you will, but they're exceeding their peers by a significant amount. So you see those different players kind of pull up here. So anyway, here's a quick list of the top players with a minimum 30 rushes, rushing the passer attempts, and they're sorted by adjusted true percentage, true pressure rate. So Leon Jacobs runs way up there, but again, he had a really high blitz rate, so something I'm not taking into account. So maybe we should have fixed that. Oh well. All right. So player talent. This is taking a step further here, and what we want to say is that if we look at the differences in true adjusted pressure rate, so say like how good you are at rushing given the locations in the field that you play, there's no significant differences now when we look at cross roster position, on field position, things like that, which means that our kind of adjusted true pressure rate is correctly adjusting across roster positions. It's correctly evaluating like a defensive tackle versus a defensive end, for example. I will say I did run some of that against blitz and non-blitz plays and things like that, and there were no significant differences as well. So I didn't end up doing some additional blitz analysis based on those findings, which I'll mention in a minute here. If we look at kind of the different groups of techniques, which I think is the easiest way, because we say it's kind of a sliding scale generally, where the over center or zero technique generates about the same amount of pressure as the 1, 2 interior and 2. That's kind of like group 1, call that an interior. We have group 3 through 5, which I'll call edge, and then 7, 6, and 9, which is kind of outside the tackle, tight end, and then outside. That's kind of like a edge plus, because I don't have a good name for it. And then off ball is off the ball, and we'll discard off the ball because we don't know exactly where they're at. All right. So if we think about it in terms of talent distribution here, this is just another way to visualize it here, how we're grouping it. All these groups are significantly different in terms of their true pressure rate, but they are not significant if we look in terms of their adjusted true pressure rate, which is just meaning that the groups, we can use true adjusted pressure rate to measure how players are doing across the different kind of groupings. But there are each of these diff groups are significantly different than others. So interior is different than edge, which is different than edge plus. All right. Oh, this is just repeating what I just said about them all being unique. I thought this was interesting here. This is just looking at like if you look at a player's roster position, where were they most likely to kind of line up based on these kind of new buckets, if you will. So defensive tackles split their time really between kind of interior / edge position. So they really play out, if you look at it here, they kind of play out oftentimes to the tackle, which is further outside than I would have kind of expected. Just to note, they tend to be not as good if they play outside. That's a unique finding. Whereas defensive ends tend to be pretty good no matter where they play in the line. So maybe speed versus size type thing there, but I'm not sure because I didn't look into it. If you look at the it's a typo, but if you look at defensive ends, they rarely played in the interior, but they played mainly on the edge and outside, or edge plus, and then linebackers were almost always coming from an edge plus type of position. All right. And I think it kind of goes to, I'll just make a quick caveat here. There has been some different folks kind of pushing for designating players as kind of interior versus exterior type of players. So interior lineman versus an edge type player, especially with kind of the differences between like a 4-3, which is 4 defensive linemen. So you'd have traditionally defensive end, tackle, end, versus a 3-4, which kind of gives you like an end, tackle, end, but then you oftentimes have a linebacker that's more in a blitzing role. Getting outside my depth, but anyway, I kind of tend to agree with that. This analysis does seem to point that kind of looking at things as like an interior versus exterior and kind of grouping them differently is probably something we should do. That being said, it does seem to be that tackles kind of play all over the interior of the line. Defensive ends typically, as if they're labeled on the roster, kind of play on the edges to very much outside, and then if someone's labeled a linebacker, they're almost always lined up outside. So they are actually semi-unique between the 3 roster positions, which I found was semi-interesting. I will note that when I did do this analysis here for talent distribution, is I'm grouping players into the groups that they played and then breaking them out. So if a player is played 50% of the time as a edge versus an edge plus, they're scored in both categories, and their average pressure against expected or adjusted true pressure rate is calculated for each group. So they're kind of seen as like talent player in this position, talent player in this position. That's done because I didn't want to assume a player is only playing one position. So if they played all over the line, I wanted to score them across the different positions here. If we look at the distribution of talent, because adjusted true pressure rate is centered about 0, as we'd expect, we can look at the just the standard deviation of those things versus like a coefficient of variance, which is you divide by the mean. The mean 0 doesn't work so well, so you just use standard deviation here. At least that's what I think. And you can see here that the standard deviation between interior players is very low. Edge and edge plus has about the same variation. It's a little higher. And then offline has the highest, but it's because of pretty low sample size for a lot of players in that group. So if we look at that kind of just a histogram chart here, it's kind of hard to tell the difference here, but essentially there isn't much a huge variation of talent, but the defensive interior tends to be a little more tightly clustered. Alright, that's just a repeating answer what I just told you. So anyway, I thought this would be fun, so this is stuff, any of the blue slides here is not stuff that I included in my submission to SIS, but I thought it'd just be kind of cool to share with you guys some of the best players in terms of their true adjusted pressure rate, in terms of kind of the different traditional player groups, and then some of the worst, then so you can make fun of your favorite teams. Or praise Aaron Donald in this case, because he generates a ton of pressure. So this is here Aaron best interior, traditionally called like a defensive tackle rushers here. So Aaron Donald, Chris Jones, who just got a bunch of money for the Chiefs, which is good. One thing I'll note here is that if we're looking at their adjusted true pressure rate, there's really only a handful of guys that are over kind of the 2-3% rate, which kind of does go to show you that the variation here is pretty small. And Aaron Jones, Chris Jones, Grady Jarrett, and a few other guys there, the max that they have above expected it's still only about 7%, 5%, 4%. As compared to this is the worst rushers. If you want to make some fun of somebody, you can go to my Patreon and I have this presentation there for you to download. You can look through those. Damian Harris and the Lions. It's disappointing. This is all rushers, I should say, or players above with more than 100 rushing attempts. Rushing attempts, rushing the passer attempts. Confuse passing and rushing plays. I don't know why we decided to name them the same thing. If we look at the kind of edge type positions, so the linebackers, defensive ends, so these players are playing on the kind of the edge or edge plus outside type players, we see that the rates here can be significantly higher than 7% or so like that. There's really only a group of maybe 5 players in the NFL that generate above kind of that 5 to 7% rate. So those guys are pretty impressive. I already talked about Leon Jacobs a little bit already, but this list is kind of the guys you'd expect, right? The Bosa brothers, Calais Campbell, have been a stalwart for many years. Shaq Barrett, Shaquille Barrett's a man crush of mine. He's awesome. TJ Watt recently. So anyway, you can go check it out. Here are the worst rushers, which I thought was entertaining. Note this is anybody with over 100 rush attempts, rushing the passer attempts, and so anyway, you can see who was like the least effective at it, and they were also asked to do it a lot. So anyway, I thought this was pretty interesting here. Poor Christian Jones was asked to rush the passer a lot and just didn't do it a whole lot. Only 5% of the times that he was asked to rush the passer did he actually pressure the passer, which is not so good. Anyway, poor guys. All right. So now let's take a quick look at teams that excelled at getting pressure. And if we look at this, the Steelers, Bucks, Ravens are teams that did a really fantastic job at getting a high rate of pressure. I want to note here that they all had very good they had very good rushers at their disposal that were generally relatively deep through the first two positions or so, and they also had a really high blitz rate. Especially the Buccaneers and the Ravens were blitzing at a really high rate, and actually all 3 of those teams were in the top 4. So the Steelers were the most successful in terms of success rate against the pass. Ravens 3rd, Bucks were 4th. Looking forward, without Jameis Winston on the Bucks, I think the Bucks could have a really good defense this year, assuming pressure rate is stable, which we don't know. It's only got half season games. Typically, if you're going to do any sort of like what predicts the future, I would assume EPA is less predictable half season to half season, like 8 games versus 8 games versus success rate. We're looking at kind of eliminating some of the different spike plays, which like sacks and turnovers, which can be semi-random, fumbles especially, kind of random versus success rate. But that being said, there's some limitations we're facing here. The Seahawks were terrible at generating pressure. They were also terrible against the pass. So anyway, they should also let Russ cook, but it's not correlated, or it's not included in this analysis. Dolphins, same thing here. There's probably a reason why they were like one of the most pass-happy teams. The defense was pretty bad. Lions here. I want to highlight something here that I thought was really interesting as I was going through this here. So Lions had like 2 and really 3 pretty good players in terms of their most common rushers or most common players playing up front in terms of their true pressure rate. However, the Seahawks and the Lions had a lot of players up front on average. The Lions had 4.71 and the Seahawks had 4.76, and both of those teams blitzed at a really low rate. So they had a lot of defenders up front, and they blitzed at a really low rate. And those 2 things, remember earlier, was looking at what correlates success, are like the things you don't want to do. So you would rather have less people up front and blitz more often, of course, you want talented players to do it. But anyway, that's just interesting. I don't really have any specific things in terms of. I have some guesses at how that might suggest a team should build. We'll get to that in a minute. Or right now. So, answering question number 3 about how different situations or things would change. This is definitely a question I was the worst at answering. I felt like I had done a lot of this analysis at looking to kind of like what correlates to success versus like the best player, and then blitz rates and shotgun rates and things like that. But I just found a lot of noise in the data, and I think there is thinking about it now, there's probably the blitz rate percentage is impacting possibly some of the true pressure rates for certain players if they also had a high blitz rate participation rate. Could be a confounding factor. But if I look at kind of things as a whole across the different positions, looking at controlling for blitzes or not, the results don't show significance. The same thing with shotgun plays. So at least from a high level, it seems like the true adjusted pressure rate for the different players it does a pretty reasonable job at accounting for the blitzing. So I'm kind of excited to see some of the other entries, or the other finalists. I say other finalists, like I'm one of them. Once the finalist comes out, and I'm excited to see them because I'm sure they answered it a whole lot better than me, and I'm excited to see what they've got. Anyway, I think some of this might be because I'm separated my analysis from cornerbacks and the defensive backs, and those players have a really high success rate when they rush from the outside. So by not including them and kind of generating a different positional value, I may have been inadvertently controlling for kind of the different blitz plays. Anyway, all right. So for roster construction, there are some suggestions that we can make. I think the biggest one is the best pass rusher matters a lot. I think what I said here, that single best pass rusher in terms of true pressure rate, counting for a play minimum, etc., had a pretty, I'd say meaningful is hard to say, but non-negligible R squared value or correlation to that team's success rate. A single player on any side of the ball being able to influence their team's success rate at a kind of a 17%, accounting for 17% of that team's variance and success rate, I thought was pretty impressive. If we look at the 2nd through 5th best pass rushers on a team, they don't correlate at all. It's really just the single best pass rusher. So those defensive edge type players that are getting tons of money being picked top 5 in the NFL draft, NFL looks to be actually making some really smart decisions there. So Chase Young, good pick. Maybe should have picked a quarterback, but defensive edge, really, really, really good one, or taking the bet on a really good one, and then getting them on a rookie deal where you can control over 5 years at a relatively affordable price is probably one of the more valuable positions. And so teams that have done that, so that's good to see. Outside of that, if the less players that you can use on the defensive line still generate pressure and then complement that with blitzing rate, seems to be like a pretty good way to success. So anyway, put your players in positions to win more. Get your best players outside and have them take on tackles and tight ends. Seems like it's too easy, right? No, it's not. I'm sure I'm missing stuff. All right, limitations of feature analysis. I think a lot of the stuff here is probably more for the competition committee. But that being said, I really would have liked to look at kind of predictability in terms of true pressure rate or adjusted true pressure rate, whatever you like, across multiple half seasons, which has been shown to be pretty effective in terms of what's actually predictive. Right now, I'm really just saying what's descriptive. So kind of have to be careful about some of the different assumptions you're making from the data. And right now, I already mentioned it, kind of blind to the different offensive personnel that's on the field, and things like that. So we have to kind of assume the offense on a pass play, shotgun or not. We know some alignment information based on technique data, but really we have to assume it's this singular pass offense, and we don't know if it's 12 personnel or 21 personnel, or if they're 4 wide or empty backfield, or got they're running a wildcat, right? I don't know. So that would be cool, but we don't have that data. Additional defender location information, so like box information. I think some information about offensive information, so offensive lineman and tight end specifically would have been good, because then you could look at like win rates versus offensive line versus defensive line, time to throw. Do certain players get double teamed a lot more, which impacts their rates, pressure rates, things like that. So we don't know, to some degree, we don't know if some players have like more weight in terms of influencing the play, in terms of the offenses playing more attention to them. So for example, Aaron Donald was only about 7 percentage points above expectations in terms of rushing, but does you get like a guard and a tackle on him, a guard and a center on him like every play? Does the running back like really worry about Aaron Donald? Don't know. So that'd been cool, but we don't have it. So anyway, I think we're just about out of time. Oh, Tim, I went 8 minutes over. Anyway, if you enjoyed it, you can follow me on Twitter and check out there. Most of my stuff is fantasy football. Do a lot of play-by-play stuff. Learning. Hopefully, getting into a master's program here. Next year, I got deferred for one. Prove my talents. If you have any suggestions, so if you're someone who's up here, a lot more experience than I am, I would love to hear some advice that you would have for me. And if you want to go check out this presentation, you want to get a copy of it, it's on my Patreon. Also got a bunch of shiny apps up there for different models, for rookie projections and all that fun stuff. So anyway, you can go check it out. Twitter or Patreon would be the places to find me if you want to get a hold or you have a comment from me. Anyway, I appreciate you guys. Thanks.